All right, so assalamu alaikum, everybody. Last time we talked about a number of different things, and if we just want to just kind of go over what we talked about. Last time we talked about um, the time, uh, the time of the Umayyad Khilafah, and we talked about some of the most important expansions, political expansions, economical expansions, educational expansion, and those expansions in those different areas, and how it impacted civilization at the time. And we also talked about the just an overview of the Umayyad Khilafah, and of course, we talked about the vastness of that and the implications it had on culture, religion, civilizations, and of course on the education. And then we also talked about the Abbasid Khilafah. We talked about how that transition took place and why some of that transition took place. It's going to be a lot to talk about, but I thought it would be good to talk about some of the political transition that was slowly happening in from the Umayyad Khilafah to the Abbasid Khilafah. And we talked about how the Umayyad Khilafah pretty much stayed within in Andalus area. The Abbasid Khilafah was, was filled with a lot of divisions on the inside. That expansion didn't last too long, and of course, the governance had a lot of different enemies. But in the end, is that it was still considered one of the most important changes within Islamic history. But of course, more and more expansion from different sides, whether it was the Umayyad, whether it was the Fatimid, the Shi'at Fatimids, and whether it was the Byzantine Empire more to the north, how that was affecting the civilization growth and the different sides, within the Muslim civilization, how things were looking differently. We also talked about some of the challenges that were happening, but we didn't still yet continue. So let's continue looking at and watching that movie, and hopefully, we'll get throughout those slides, inshallah. So let's look at the movie right here. This is in Masjid al-Aqsa, and of course, in Masjid al-Aqsa, we've got a number of things. Number one is that Masjid al-Aqsa itself is one of the most important Umayyad architecture, and with that architecture, the change was resembling a very important civilization, very important piece, which is on the inside. The whole Surah Taha, written on the Quran, which was considered one of the most earliest manuscripts for the Quran, on the walls of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. We also talked about how the Umayyad Khilafah was many times, what is the word to use, but very many misconceptions about the Umayyad Khilafah was spreading, and we talked a lot about why that happened. So let's move on with
and
this
his
one.
followers had established an empire larger than Rome. But Muhammad never lived to see it. In the 11th year of the Islamic calendar, 632 AD, only 2 years after the taking of Mecca, Muhammad died. Medina fell into despair. For days, the city was consumed with sorrow and ceremony.
He's known to have said that he wanted to be buried very simply, with no marker over his grave. He didn't want people to worship his grave. That would interfere with their worship of God.
God had spoken to them only through Muhammad. Now that the Prophet had...
What we did mention, I know this is really irritating, but we did talk about the wailing that the video portrays was totally not what what Islam really is, and that was not even happening. But you could see the covering their faces, the wailing, all that, and it's really annoying, I must admit, for myself at least. The wailing and all that sounds that are coming out. It was really more of a stereotypical image right there of very Bedouin style, very old-fashioned wailing, very jahiliya, if you'd want to call it. But unfortunately, even though the video or the movie was trying to somehow eliminate the stereotypical images, at least somehow, it still did not run away, and it still did use those stereotypical images still.
Left them. Perhaps God would as well.
Muhammad's death set up a crisis in the young Islamic community. The question of succession was the first thing that really occupied people's concerns. At this point, there was a divergence of opinion as to how the community should go about choosing a new leader. According to the Shiites faction, the Shia of Ali, Muhammad had indeed designated Ali, his son-in-law and cousin, as his successor. The opinion that came to be the majority opinion, or the Sunni opinion, held that Muhammad had not appointed a successor during his life, but had said,
let me comment on this one, because this acts as a very major issue in Islamic history. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, dies 11-year Hijrah, and there starts that division between the Sunni and the Shia. So for the Sunni, governance is more political. It's a political governance, and therefore it doesn't have to be anointed. It's not chosen by the Prophet, peace be upon him. It's not. It is not designated outside of Quraysh. So it was just an issue of Quraysh, with the tribe of Quraysh, that the leader would be from the tribes of Quraysh. Tribes of Quraysh are vast, of course. And that hadith is an authentic hadith. The only person that regarded that, no, it doesn't have to be from the tribes of Quraysh, but it can include outside of the tribes of Quraysh, because this is political governance and it doesn't have to be Quraysh, was actually Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun, he regarded that, no, it doesn't have to be from the tribes of Quraysh, and the hadith al-immatu min Quraysh, that governors, or those al-imma, meaning those that are leading the ummah, are supposed to be from Quraysh. Ibn Khaldun regarded that as not authentic, and therefore all this is just political. Versus Shia, on the other hand, they went to the very other side and regarded that, no, governance are supposed to be appointed, one, that it was from Ali's descendants, meaning going back to Fatima, the Prophet ﷺ's daughter, and Ali ibn Abi Talib's children, and therefore goes back to the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself, and that those are supposed to be the ones to lead the ummah, and those are the ones that are going to be the future leaders of Quraysh. And from there on, Shias regarded that any type of governance that is not from Ali ibn Abi Talib was later going to be regarded as more of a betrayal and a treason against God Almighty's order. And in fact, it went farther, in where they went and regarded anybody that went against the Prophet, peace be upon him. Of course, to them, it was an order. So they considered that that is an order. And from that, regarded any nation or any leader that is not appointed by Ali ibn Abi Talib or his descendants or the Shia, were more committing a treason against Islam, and therefore regarded Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, regarded that Umar ibn al-Khattab and Muawiyah, and the list goes on and on, Khilafah al-Uthmaniyya, all those khilafas, all those Islamic governance throughout history, except the Fatimi, they regarded them as really had committed treason and therefore illegal, un-Islamic, and uh, and even kafir. Here's the word, and even kafir. And that acts, you guys pay attention to this, that acted as one of the main reasons for a lot of the different treasons that were committed from the Shia groups within the Islamic governance to support whether the Mongols during the Abbasid era, or whether it was to support the Crusades against the Muslims during the Crusade Wars, and the list goes on and on. And it was always, these groups that actually went and considered that the main reason for this type of, what is the word, but malicious, to go against the the prevalent Muslim governance, was really because that those governance were, one, Sunni and not appointed by the Al Bayt, by the family of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and therefore those governance were illegal, meaning illegal from a Muslim standpoint, and therefore it was their duty to go against and to try to make those governance collapse. That's a long history, but unfortunately this resulted in a lot of division. And until today, until our modern time, these divisions still actually exist. So unfortunately, just a note to bring about, well, what is this main issue? The Muslims did finally, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, in what is called the Saqifat Bani Sa'ida, the Saqifat Bani Sa'ida did at the end agree to pledge to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq would be the first caliphate, the first one to govern after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And of course, but the Shias regarded that, no, this was a betrayal, even though Ali ibn Abi Talib 6 months later did actually pledge to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. But again, this was considered a betrayal, and this was considered that Ali ibn Abi Talib did it for hypocritical diplomatic reasons, and that was not an evidence to prove that Ali ibn Abi Talib was accepting all this. So just an issue to keep in mind, because this is going to come infrequently.
Go on, choose one from among your peers, from among the elders. And from the house there came out the man who would be his successor, Abu Bakr. He addressed the people and said, if you worship Muhammad, know that he is dead. If you worship God, know that he lives forever.
Here was the secret to Islam's strength and profound influence. The unifying power of one God, merciful and compassionate, the power of one people, bound by a common faith. Muhammad did not lead the conquest or create the empire to come. The transforming power of his message did. Out of that message would spring a font of knowledge that would transform humanity. As Islam continued to spread its reach far and wide, awaiting the Muslims would be a new age. They would be destined for enlightenment, for new horizons, and a clash of great powers, the like of which the world had never seen. During the 7th and 8th centuries AD, a powerful new faith was about to change the world, the faith of Islam. Its followers launched a conquest not only by the sword, but with the power of ideas. 200 years after the death of Muhammad, his message and the new Arab Empire were transforming 3 continents.
Now comes a new empire, a political new configuration, driven by a religious and newly defined civilization. This new civilization expanding beyond its own dreams within a period of very short time. Literally, the largest empire civilization had ever known.
The Arabic word for conquest, fatu, literally means openings.
Definitely, it was not Fatu. It's actually Fath, but not Fatu. Fath means opening, not
Islam
Fatu.
sowed the seeds of its faith to the 4 winds, and a world of opportunities opened before it. But the vast empire's spiritual core remained at its birthplace, the holy city of Mecca. From every corner of the Muslim world, the faithful embarked on the traditional journey to Mecca, a sacred pilgrimage known as the Hajj.
The pilgrimage became a central devotional and ritual feature in Islamic life. In fact, since the life of Muhammad himself, the pilgrimage has symbolized, probably more than any other Islamic ritual activity, unity among all people and equality.
The Hajj set humanity in motion. For the first time since the reign of Alexander the Great, cultures and caravans now flowed freely. Borders closed for 1,000 years opened.
Both ideas and goods went back and forth over incredible distances. Since every Muslim is enjoined once in his life to visit Mecca, it means that there were caravans carrying goods and pilgrims and ideas and people. And they all met together in Mecca once a year, and then things would radiate back home. So if there was an invention that was discovered in Samarkand, it could be within the year that it would be known in Cordoba.
Where pilgrims trod, traders soon followed. Muhammad himself had been a man of commerce, and now the spread of his message brought with it the spread of trade and the Islamic way of life.
Trade was incredibly important in the Islamic world simply because of its geographical position. It was, and still is, between West, what we call the West, and what people always call the East. So it was a natural land bridge connecting China to Europe.
In only 2 centuries, Islam had extended its reach from Spain all the way to the edge of India. It took nearly a year to travel from one end of the Arab Empire to the other. At its heart was a fabled city of wealth. It was called Baghdad. The palaces of ancient Baghdad have been lost over the centuries. But in its glory, it rivaled ancient Athens or Rome. It was a magnificent architectural achievement, the pride of Islam in a new age. One visitor left this account. All the exquisite neighborhoods covered with parks, gardens, villas, and beautiful promenades are filled with bazaars and finely built mosques and baths. They stretch for miles on both sides of the glittering river. But what made this the greatest city of its time was more than just what met the eye. It was the company it kept. Scholars made Baghdad the jewel of the world.
Certainly from the 8th century on, Baghdad was the center of learning in the Islamic world, and all major innovations either came from Baghdad or quickly came to Baghdad because
I did realize that we did watch this segment last time, but unfortunately, I totally forgot about it. But in the end, I think it's really important to go back to what we talked about, but I'm just gonna let the video in the movie roll. And that way we could watch it all, watch it together, and rather than me pausing it frequently. But to listen to the comments, please go back to the video. I will be commenting on what I did not say last time, but it's very important to go back to last week's commentary, because there were a lot of things that I commented on, a lot of what they had said.
the best people came to Baghdad, the best thinkers, the best philosophers, the best artists.
They came in search of answers to pragmatic questions. The empire's meteoric growth had left its new leaders overwhelmed. They had staggering engineering and logistical problems to contend with. Solving them would take the greatest minds of the day.
Under the new empire now, you are responsible for public hygiene, you are responsible for the marketplace, you are responsible for goods being sold in the marketplace. All of those require some basic elementary sciences. This new civilization having a need for science really stems from the need to run that empire.
The best minds rose to the call. The finest were welcomed at a center of scholarship, Baghdad's renowned House of Wisdom.
It was a magnet for scholars and intellectuals who came and worked in the academies. There were public libraries associated with the palace, and scholars came from all over the empire. There were scholars from Iran, there were scholars from Byzantium who came. Some were Christians, some were Muslims, some were Jews. And all of these different sort of threads of human knowledge came together in the city of Baghdad.
So the net effect of this is that you've got human individuals from radically different cultural traditions being thrown into the same crucible.
The challenge that greeted these scholars was daunting. The great works of the ancients had to be transformed into a wholly new body of knowledge. Competition for jobs developed within a new intellectual elite.
And from there on, every single scientist is competing for that job. That they were competing among themselves almost just in the same way that modern bureaucrats and modern academicians will fight among themselves.
You know, it is really important to go back to this guy that was just talking to his lectures. I forgot what George Saliba. His name is George Saliba. He's got a number of good lectures, and he's got a number of books on Islam and Islamic astronomy and mathematics. And he actually many times would, I would say, shed the light on how a lot of the European academia deliberately wiped out and totally eliminated the Muslim academia and the Muslim effect on Western civilization. And he will say that outwardly, and will pinpoint those points in history, and will what is the word? But will clarify that scandal. Let me say it that way, and will really scrutinize those points. And he did an awesome job in some of those lectures. You could actually go back to his lectures on YouTube. You can go back to some of his books. His name is George Saliba. George Saliba. And George Saliba is not Muslim, just like you could see from his own name.
Scholars were dispatched across the empire to locate as many ancient texts as possible. The first international scientific venture in history. Unlike their Christian counterparts, Muslim thinkers saw no insurmountable contradiction between their faith and the laws governing the natural world. So they embraced Aristotle and Plato, right as the Christian Church. It is they who translated and transformed the writings of the Greeks and made a gift of them to the modern Western world. The Renaissance had its beginnings in Baghdad.
They managed to assimilate quite a lot of the rich legacy of the Hellenistic world, translated into Arabic initially, which was then made available to all other participants in the new Islamic civilization. Arabic emerges as the language of learning throughout the region. This is a very significant development in human intellectual history.
The scientific process was born.
They wanted to know why a very intelligent Greek scientist whose text they were just admiring and they were verifying it, why would he make a mistake in the first place? So they began to dig, was it because he didn't have the right instruments? Or is it because he didn't have the right methodology to use the instruments for the verifications of observation? It is this spirit, you see, the spirit of questioning, the spirit of saying that we have to build science.
So this is how you write his name. You saw his name on there.
Constantly on a systematic, consistent basis where we make a physical proposition of how the universe ought to be run and the mathematical representation of that physical universe ought to match. Now you begin to have what I call the birth of the new Islamic science.
Algebra and trigonometry, engineering and astronomy, countless disciplines integral to our lives today, trace their roots to Islamic scientists. More surprising, perhaps, were their innovations in medicine. At a time when Europeans were praying to the bones of their saints to cure their illnesses, Muslim physicians developed an innovative theory that disease was transmitted through tiny airborne organisms, the precursor to the study of germs. They determined that sick patients should be quarantined and then treated. This is the basis of the institution most fundamental to medicine today, the hospital. Funded mainly through religious endowments, Muslim hospitals had separate wards for patients suffering from different kinds of disease. Even mental illness was treated. Their studies of anatomy were so sophisticated that they remained in use by Muslim and European physicians for 600 years. Muslim scientists were especially intrigued by light, lenses, and the physiology of the human eye. The father of optics was a Muslim named Ibn al-Haytham. His work with lenses eventually led to the invention of the modern camera. He produced the first treatise that ventured to explain how the eye actually sees. A 1,000 years before the West dared to take up the practice, Muslim doctors were removing cataracts surgically, clearing them from the eye with a hollow needle. But for all this knowledge to learning and knowledge today, paper.
Around the year 700, 750, when Muslim armies reached Central Asia, they encountered paper for the first time. And very quickly, the Muslim bureaucracy started using paper. You find that, you know, within 50 years, it's in Syria, and then a few years after that, it's in Egypt, and then it's in North Africa, and then it's in Sicily, and then it's in Spain. And that's where Europe learned to make paper from. They learned to make it from the Arabs.
We begin to have people with family names like papermaker. So in other words, it not only that paper was available, it must have become a very, very widespread industry. And hence, the acquisition of books must have also become very easy.
With the wide use of books and paper, hundreds of scribes, some of whom were women, were kept busy transcribing the translations and new writings of the Baghdad scholars.
On paper, and that these books are being copied and recopied and sent around. We know, for example, that there was a street of booksellers with more than 100 shops, each one with paper and books for sale. And this is a time when, you know, in Europe, a monastery would be lucky if it had 5 or 10 books.
While the monks of the West were hoarding their wisdom on scraps of expensive parchment, paper enabled Islamic civilization to spread its newfound knowledge far and wide, creating a single community linking 3 continents.
So the chief distinction, therefore, of Islamic civilization, in addition to the fact that it made new leaps of originality, new transformations in traditions of learning and everything else possible, is the fact that it enabled human beings to consider the possibility of thinking about the globe as a single unit, humanity.
In all the broad empire, there was one place the Christian world could experience the lifestyle Muslims now took for granted: southern Spain. Here, on the European continent itself, Islamic culture would begin to have an effect on the European civilization around it. 1,000 years ago, the Spanish city of Cordoba was a center of learning and culture that rivaled Baghdad. Today, Cordoba's narrow lanes hearken to its medieval past. During the Dark Ages, this was the most prosperous and sophisticated metropolis on the continent. It had streetlights and paved roads, libraries, hospitals and palaces. This was a city of light, a Muslim city.
The city of Cordoba in the 9th and 10th centuries was one of the biggest and most exciting in Europe. We have descriptions of it by people coming and saying, all these flowers everywhere, this open streets, this wonderful light coming down. Northern cities were dark. Cordoba had running water. People lived in big houses. In contrast, in Paris, people lived in shacks by the side of the river.
The glory of medieval Cordoba is here, in what is now the great Roman Catholic Cathedral in the middle of town. But the Cordoba Cathedral of today began its life as a mosque, one of the grandest of the Islamic Empire.
The Great Mosque in Cordoba was simply the biggest mosque in the biggest city in southern Europe.
When you climb up into the church tower, which used to be a minaret, you look out over this expanse of roof. It's quite amazing to see this cathedral complete with flying buttresses popping up out of the middle of this massive mosque.
Many people came to visit it to view the wonders of the mosque, which had rib vaulting, the kind of vaulting which is like this, and which 100 years later, by a mere coincidence you might think, but not at all a coincidence, appears in the Gothic cathedrals of Northern Europe, in Lincoln Cathedral, in Chartres Cathedral in France, Where does that come from? Obviously, influenced by the great Mosque of Cordoba in the south of Spain.
For the occasional European Christian traveler, Cordoba was their one opportunity to glimpse the Islamic world. What they saw was shocking. Most of Europe at that time languished in poverty and squalor. Cordoba was a pageant.
By the way, you guys, this masjid that you see in front of you, first of all, Muslims ruled in Andalus or Spain for 800 years. And this particular masjid was actually a masjid that so many scholars were actually heads of this masjid, leading major classes and halaqas in Islamic legislature, Islamic jurisprudence, and hadith. You name the Islamic science, and you name the science, in fact, in general, and Muslims were leading figures, and some of the most important scholars were each holding a class in this huge masjid. Now, you want to remember is that masajid at the time were considered universities. This is where they were leading the most important classes. So it's, you sit and you see this masjid, which has been turned into a church, and your heart really bleeds to see one thing is if you're walking in the masjid and you could hear the sounds of scholars' voices around you, just looking at that masjid and that huge masjid, and now it was just all history as if it never existed.
Of prosperity and enlightenment.
In the 10th century, there was a Saxon nun with the unpronounceable name of Hrotsvitha, who called medieval Cordoba the ornament of the world. She was very, very taken with the place. And there you are, she's a Christian nun.
As Europeans made their way from the cold stone of their northern castles into the glorious Muslim cities of southern Spain, they couldn't help but be impressed. In the green hills above Granada was a palace of startling elegance, a shining example of the richness and sophistication Islam brought to medieval Europe. It is called the Alhambra.
The Alhambra is perhaps the most famous example of Islamic architecture to most Westerners. It is the best remaining example of what a medieval Muslim palace would have looked like.
Echoed in the finely carved geometric plasterwork and marble pillars is a vanished lifestyle of extraordinary luxury. The Alhambra reveals the pinnacle of Islamic culture and urbanity.
The beauty of the Alhambra is not so much in the individual details. It's more the combination of everything. That is, this wonderful sort of orchestrated interplay of different textures and surfaces, of light and space and water playing inside and outside of building. It's almost like a symphony of different elements that are very carefully brought together to provide exquisite enjoyment.
Here, the Muslim elite relished the good life. Reposing on lush carpets, surrounded by perfume and music, the privileged few debated the nature of God, the subtleties of Greek philosophy, or the most recent mathematical revelations from India, while they dined on spiced delicacies served on Chinese porcelains. They strolled the grounds through gardens irrigated by complex gravity-fed water systems. How far Muhammad's followers had come from the life of desert nomads. How distant they felt from the rest of the European continent they now shared. Christian Europe, due north, was struggling on through the Dark Ages. But at the dawn of the 11th century, a tragedy in Jerusalem would put Muslims and European Christians on a collision course. Jerusalem was ruled by an Egyptian caliph, an infamous man named Al-Hakim.
Al-Hakim was certainly a deviation from the norm. Clinically speaking, I suppose today we'd regard him as a madman, as someone who was simply insane.
I want to comment on this guy. His name is Al-Hakim bi-Amrillah. It wasn't really in Jerusalem only, but Al-Hakim bi-Amrillah has really caused a lot of trouble. I'm going to write down his name if this just allows me to. It doesn't want me to. So Al-Hakim bi-Amrillah, he really caused a lot of trouble simply because Al-Hakim bi-Amrillah,
for 200 years,
Al-Hakim bi-Amrillah actually, he was not only oppressive to Muslims, but he was also oppressive to every single person. So his name is Al-Hakim bi-Amrillah. Now this guy, to Muslims, he was extremely oppressive. To women, he prevented them from leaving their homes. To Christians and Jews, he forced them to wear yellow turbans and forced them to wear very distinguished clothes from the rest of the people. And of course, to Muslims, he was actually very oppressive in where he killed people in massive numbers, etc. Why is this guy important to talk about? Because a lot of the different writings that will talk about Muslim rule, they will focus on the Ahl al-Dhimma, which were considered the non-Muslim citizens within the Muslim governance, and they will only talk about him as if it was the prevalent, common situation that the non-Muslim citizens were living within the Muslim world or throughout history. And this is very, very important to mention, because Al-Hakim bi-Amrillah was not only oppressive against the non-Muslims, but he was even oppressive to Muslims, even oppressive to women, and brought in a lot of destruction. And to say that that this governance or this bad oppressive regime that Al-Hakim bi-Amrillah was leading, as if it was the common situation that all Muslim governance was doing, is definitely not objective to least say. So this is not subjective to actually talk about this, rule as if it was all the time. And in fact, it is very important to mention that scholars from different parts of the world did at the time send or put forward fatwa and did send notes to Al-Hakim bi-Amrillah that what he is doing is actually oppressive and is not what God Almighty permits. But of course, He did not care. This guy was like he said, he was more like a madman, did not care in being oppressive to Muslims and non-Muslims. But unfortunately, like I said, you would always hear in the writings, in the Orientalist writings, that the Muslims were ordering the non-Muslim citizens to dress in a certain manner, to wear certain things, to that prevented them from practicing their civil rights, etc., is actually only, that was only the case during al-Hakim bi-Amrillah, and was not the case in all Muslim rules and all Muslim governance. But this is just a note to mention that unfortunately this is not subjective to say that this man was actually warned by many Muslim scholars that what he is doing is not a Muslim practice. So just to note that.
Christian holy places in Jerusalem had been respected and protected by Muslim rulers. In 1009, the Egyptian ruler Al-Hakim broke with that tradition. He ordered the holiest church in Christendom destroyed.
And horror of horrors, he burnt down the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Now, nobody knows quite why he did it, and you can have your own theories about it, but the fact of the matter was that that sent shivers of terror and anxiety through Christendom.
In a way, of course, Al-Hakim was the one exception that proved the rule for Christians that Christians had been speaking of for centuries, of Muslims as intolerant, mad, slavering heretics who simply could not be expected to abide by the rules of civilized human beings.
This is a very important quote that he had mentioned, is that it was, it was taking that moment in history and making as if it was the common rule on Islamic governance or Muslim governance, that it was going to be marginalizing, it was going to take away other civilians' rights, etc., and not really talking about al-Hakim bi-Amrillah as if he was actually an exception throughout Muslim history, but bringing him as it was the common Muslim rule, and that was actually prevalent, and did not mention that in other times, and in fact throughout Muslim history, that whether Ahl al-Dhimma or in fact the Prophet, peace be upon him, had actually said, whoever harms a dhimmi, the word dhimmi would mean a person that that we would have an agreement with, a truce agreement with. And the Prophet ﷺ clearly said that whoever harms a dhimmi it is as if he had harmed me. But unfortunately, like you could see, that these professors as well did mention it, that was promoted as if it was the common Muslim rule, and that was something that was acceptable. And this is, want to point out some of those names that would use this frequently in our modern times to say that this is a Muslim rule, that this was acceptable, and all that. And some of those names you'll see a woman, an Egyptian woman, forgot her name was, but Gabriel, forgot what her name was. She's always on my head, but now it slipped my mind. Another guy is Daniel Pipes and Robert Spencer. Those people, although Daniel Pipes is a Harvard graduate, Robert Spencer, I believe is also, I think he's also a Harvard graduate. And there's another lady, something Gabriel, I forgot what her name was. When they speak of Islam, you could see the anger in their eyes. And unfortunately, those are the main figures that are always talking about Islam as if it was the most dangerous thing in the world. There's another Palestinian guy who is right now, training. That's what he says he does. Training police officers, politicians about Islam, something Shuaib, and he was actually caught. It was actually caught delivering those lectures and lying about all the details, calling himself that he was an ex-Muslim and that Islam was, practicing some kind of a hidden agenda to terrorize the world, etc. And same thing when we're talking about Daniel Pipes, Robert Spencer writing all those books that non-Muslims are going to be second-class citizens and that every single Muslim is going to be a danger to the world. And there's Cheryl Benard. Cheryl Benard is actually one of those dangerous figures. I would say, why did I call her dangerous? Because in her book, and that book is actually called Civil Democratic Islam. In her book, she went really far in laying out agendas on how to change Islam within and by changing the Muslims, and went and put in all these agendas, such as forcing different um, governments, Muslim countries' governments to adopt new styles of what Islamic interpretation should look like, and it should go in parallel with the liberal, and this is exactly what she was saying, the liberal understanding, the Western understanding of modernization and human rights and women rights and all these different ideas, that they should be in parallel with the secular and liberal lifestyle, and put in all these agendas to replace, for example, the stories of the Prophet's companions in the Muslim history books, and replace them with the old stories that were mentioned in the books of the pre-Islamic era, Antar bin Shaddad and Imru al-Qais and all these different people. And number two is scrutinize those people that are promoting the Arabic language, the fiqh studies, and all these different Islamic studies, and memorizing Quran, and targeting those groups and trying to eliminate their powers by pressuring the different governments to dismantle all those organizations from teaching Islam, and on the other hand, promote with money, with media, the different organizations that will spread the liberal, the secular, democratic, this is what you called lifestyle that helps promote Western understanding. Now this, you might seem, well, this seems like a conspiracy. This is something that, this is not a conspiracy. This is something that that Cheryl Benard and also the Rand Institute, this is an acronym that they actually put forward, and it is out in their books, and you could actually see all their different actions. This is not a hidden agenda, but this is actually outwardly laid out. But unfortunately, many times Muslims are totally unaware of those agendas and would just think, oh, it's just a conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy. It is a conspiracy, meaning planned, but it's not hidden. It's right there. So unfortunately, institutes and think tanks, they're called think tanks, institutes and think tanks and all those different people, they will be promoting that Islam is dangerous by more focusing on those times in history where I would say had probably or actually had gone wrong. So just something to, to look into, because when we're talking, I'll share a story. I was one time given a lecture at a church, and amongst the crowd was a guy that was sitting down, and he had on his shirt a badge, well, not a badge, but you know, those name tags. And on the name tag, it actually had this sign on it. So he's sitting amongst the crowd, but of course he wanted to deliver me a message, and this is the sign that it had on it. And if I would ask you what do you think this sign is, I don't think any of you would be familiar with this sign. So this sign is basically an organization. Of course, this guy is sitting amongst the crowd, to say that they were the Christians that were living amongst the Muslim world and that had faced prosecution. And the N was to say that he is a Christian that used to live within the Muslim world that was being prosecuted. And of course, they formed an organization or organizations in order to promote this idea that they were prosecuted within the Muslim world. And it's like, what are you talking about? And what are you talking about? Who's prosecuting you? You're living exactly. In fact, you've got more privilege than other people. But this is just an idea of how to promote those stereotypical images, even when, of course, this person knew that I was Muslim, that I was going to deliver a lecture, but he wanted to point something at my face and say, yeah, all that you're saying is actually lies. So you will be coming across these different things in the community. So just keep note of that. Let's say it that way.
The fact that Al-Hakim's successor rebuilt the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it was done by 1048 with Byzantine help, didn't cut any ice. There was this perception now that things were not going well in the Holy Land.
In Europe, anti-Muslim sentiment simmered. By 1095, it reached the boiling point. Pope Urban II spent most of that year traveling through France, imploring his feudal lords to unite in a campaign of bloodshed.
All right, so this is actually going to a totally different era. This is Pope Urban II, now putting the foundation of a huge, massive military and a political leadership called the Crusaders to right now invade Al-Quds, to invade Jerusalem, to invade the Muslim world in a massive number, in bringing in a new era and targeting the Muslim world for the first time in history. Right now we're looking at a different kind of an invasion, and under the pretense that the Christian sites, the tomb of the Jesus, peace be upon him, was under danger from the Muslim governance. So this is a totally new era that we're going to go into, but I'm going to stop right there and I'm going to take some questions before we end right here. So whoever wants to ask any question, just raise your hand, and inshallah I'll unmute you, inshallah, because we don't want to make the lectures long. Unfortunately, I know that the numbers are small. That's because I wasn't able to record it on Facebook. All of a sudden I get a message that I'm not able to record on Facebook, and I have to update the Google Chrome that I was using. So if somebody wants to ask a question, you can go ahead. All right, so I guess no questions. We'll let you all go right now, and we'll continue next week at the same time, about the same time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.